every gospel writer is good about being able to track movements and to make sure that they do the movements of what's taking place in the life of Jesus. He was in Cana in John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. And I think I mentioned last week that Cana was a small village that wasn't that far away from the Sea of Galilee. So that's in the region where he is right now. Where does he go? According to John chapter 2, verse 12. Where does he go? He went to Capernaum. So what was Capernaum? As far as its relationship to Jesus, what was Capernaum? What was Capernaum? It was kind of a base of operations for him when you go to the city of Capernaum, because it included the place of Peter, Andrew, Matthew, possibly even John and James. Because most of these individuals were of what occupation? Fishermen, and so they were right there on the Sea of Galilee. And Capernaum is really, truly right on the Sea of Galilee. So a couple of notable things that I'll show you and that we will be looking at as in time. One of the notable miracles that Jesus is going to work, it's going to take us a while to get there, is the healing of Peter's who? Mother-in-law. So there is, in this particular area right here, it is archaeologically believed that this is where Peter's mother-in-law literally could have lived. Okay? So that's one very important point. But the other point to this is an area that is right here. Okay. So here was Peter's mother-in-law's house, and I'll show you something about that in just a second. But right here is the ruins of a synagogue. And we'll talk more about these ruins in time to come in this lesson. But these are the ruins of a synagogue. Now, this is not a first century synagogue. The ruins that they found were probably more in the 4th century. But the point is, it gives us an idea of what a synagogue actually looked like. So that'll be to come. But as far as Capernaum is concerned, what Catholics did was that they built a house. They built a church. So here's the ruins of the synagogue, looking at it from a different angle. Over here is where Peter's mother-in-law's home ruins are. And as you can see, or hopefully you can see, there is now a church over the top of it. So do you see that? There's no longer ruins. There's a church over the top. And literally, when you walk up to this church, there's a gap between the floor of the church and the ruins of several feet. I mean, you can see right through it. So, obviously, because it's Peter's mother-in-law's home, to Catholics, it's a revered place. And they built this church over the ruins in Capernaum. So John chapter 2, verse 12 now, he goes down to Capernaum, he, his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they did not stay there what? They did not stay there many days. So what do you find from John chapter 2, verse 12 that's interesting to you? What do you find that's interesting to you in John 2, verse 12? Jesus had what? He had brothers. He had family. He has brothers and also his disciples. It indicates the language that we see, and this is not the only time that it's going to be mentioned. They'll be mentioned multiple other times throughout the Gospels. But there is this strong indication that when they're mentioned, Jesus was the firstborn, which makes perfect sense. Why? Because Jesus was born of a virgin. And it's not just that obvious point, but the way in which the Gospel writers lay it out, they consistently lay it out that Jesus was the firstborn of all of these children. So making this kind of underlying argument by implication that supports the rest of the teaching of the New Testament. Okay, what problem do Catholics have with this? Because not only did she have this immaculate conception, but then what continued after that? Her perpetual virginity. Yeah, that's exactly right. And that is a very, very important doctrine to Catholics. I mean, I think that I think, and actually Brother Rolando is very, very good to come up here and talk to me about Catholic thought, Catholic doctrine. So I'm going to say this, and hopefully it's going to be correct. So if Catholics were to put God above everyone else, below that would be Jesus Christ, below that would be Peter, and then right below that, or right on the same level, would be Mary. Very, very, very important to Catholics. We understand Mary, of course, as someone who was important in the whole account of the New Testament because this great, tremendous miracle was worked through her. But beyond that, there is no respect or adoration or worship that's given to her. It's very, very different with Catholics. And in order to support that doctrine, the perpetual virginity of Mary says that she could not have had any more children. So that means that every time that the gospel writers bring up the brothers and sisters of Jesus, Catholic tradition usually puts forth one of two solutions. Either they're all children of Joseph, but not of Mary, or secondly, they're all cousins. They're all cousins. And again, the way the New Testament is put together and the way that the language is used, that is the language of brothers or of brethren, the way all of that language is chosen shows that those two options that Catholics put forth, that it's either children of Joseph, just children of Joseph, half children of Mary, or that they are cousins, just can't be what the New Testament writers are expressing. Jesus was the firstborn child of Joseph and Mary. But Joseph and Mary had other children. Another fairly strong implication for what it's worth, in the New Testament, Joseph is only mentioned when? Joseph is only mentioned surrounding his birth. So by the time we get to, say, John chapter 2, Jesus is an adult, and it just mentions he and his mother. There's a relatively decent implication that what has happened to Joseph. That at this point in time, he's actually died. And there is some tradition that backs that up, not Catholic tradition, but there is some tradition that backs that up. But the idea that this was just children of Joseph or that these were cousins just is not supported by the way the New Testament uses the language. John just uses this as a point of movement for Jesus. They had come to Capernaum, he, his mother, his brothers, and they did not stay there many days. Because in chapter 2, verse 13, where were they going? Well, they were going to Jerusalem, yes. And why were they going to Jerusalem? Because the Passover of the Jews was at hand. This was the first of 5 festivals that are mentioned by John. And this is actually pretty incredible. The first of 5 that are mentioned by John. So first of all, you have this Passover. Then you have in chapter 5, verse 1, a feast of the Jews. There was nothing else that John gave, but only the feast of the Jews. We'll talk about that when we get to John chapter 5. There was the Feast of Tabernacles in chapter 7. There was the Feast of Dedication in chapter 10, verse 22. Of course, the Feast of Dedication was not a Jewish feast given by God per se. What was the Feast of Dedication? 3 names that it goes by. Feast of Dedication is one of them. Feast of Lights is another one. The third one is Hanukkah. So John chapter 10, verse 22 is talking about Hanukkah, a feast of dedication. Then the second Passover in chapter 11 and in chapter 12. So these are all of the feasts that are mentioned by John. Now, interestingly, the other gospel writers only talk about Jesus going to Jerusalem one time as an adult. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke only talk about Him going one time as an adult. So that kind of shows the relative interest of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, making sure that they cover more of His work to the north, up in Galilee and Samaria, where John seems to focus on what happens in and around Jerusalem. So we get to John chapter 2, verse 13. What is the focus of what's going on? Jesus goes up to Jerusalem for this feast, and what happens? He found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves and the money changers doing their business. So where would this have been in the temple? So this would have been out in the court of the Gentiles. So the courts of the Gentiles, or the court of the Gentiles, was around in this larger area that is out in here, and then also out and around the temple. So this particular area was an area that was covered with a lot of porches. You'll see there, that porch on that side, and then also on another side over there. But out in this big common area, what would the Jews and what would the people there do? In this big area here, what would they do? They were selling animals. So when it was actually a necessary thing, because you came to the feast, and what did you have to do? Well, you had to offer an animal. But if you were traveling a long distance away, and of course you remember a long distance back to them were 60, 80 miles away, you couldn't just what? Everyone couldn't just do what? They couldn't bring an animal with them. Also, when you came to Jerusalem, you had to pay a temple tax. That goes all the way back to the book of Exodus. But if you lived in some place that was relatively far off, what do you not have? You don't have Jewish money, at least not Jewish money that's applicable for the temple tax. So what do you have to do with it? You've got to get it exchanged. So it's not that these were just unnecessary or unneeded things that were being done. They were needed, but what was the problem? What? So there's two instances of Jesus cleansing the temple. This is pretty much at the beginning. The last one's going to be where? Or when? Right before, or right as He's about to enter into Jerusalem. It's way late in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There have been some that have speculated that they are the same instance, but John puts it at the beginning, Matthew, Mark, and Luke put it at the end. But when we get to the second one, we'll note that there's a lot of differences between the two of them, showing that these were two different instances. And you can imagine that would perfectly agree with human nature. Jesus goes in and He does this, very, very public act. He cleans everyone out. Everything is just fine. And then what happens? What happens? What does human nature tell you? Remember, the second cleansing of the temple is going to be 3 years from now. He goes in, He cleanses the temple, He throws everyone out, and within just a short period of time, what happens? Everything goes right back to normal. I mean, I hope I'm not being, I hope you guys don't think this is too cynical, but you know what happened last week with the man being shot? There were lots of people, lots of pundits who were saying that this is a watershed event in American history. And it probably is for about 2 weeks. And then what's going to happen? The news cycle literally just cycles it away. I hope you guys don't think I'm being too cynical, but that's just what happens. So if someone could have said, why in the world are there 2 cleansings of the temple? I mean, Jesus couldn't have possibly done it twice. Well, really? I mean, if you think about Jesus looking at and seeing, by the way, in the second instance, Jesus calls them robbers, which probably gives a good indication of what the real true trouble was. But when Jesus cleanses that temple, we know that human nature is going to kind of bleed everything back to the status quo of the way that it was. So He comes back to Jerusalem a second time. And what does He want to do again? Cleanse the temple. Cleanse the temple. So again, it wasn't that they were unnecessary, but what was the problem? They were making the Lord's house a what? First of all, a house of merchandise, but then secondly, a den of thieves. You know, the Lord, and as me and the men kind of jump into the minor prophets over the next 9 weeks, and I'm going to try my absolute best to cover 12 prophets in 9 months, 9 class periods. We're going to see that yes, idolatry was the major overarching problem, but another problem was just them treating each other fairly and justly and equitably, just being fair with one another. So in the regular commerce of life, God allows there to be profit to be taken because that's just a natural part of life. But He doesn't want what? He doesn't want what? People taking advantage of one another, either by the false weights in the Old Testament, or by someone knowing that someone was at a disadvantage and then taking an opportunity back, which is what it seems like was taking place here. And this causes Jesus to act. There are some people who would say, and they do actually have a really good point, this is kind of the first public act of Jesus. Now, really important stuff has already taken place. The temptation and His baptism. But this is kind of the first public work of Jesus. So when you look in verse 14, He found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves and the money changers doing business. And when He had made a whip of cords, He drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen and poured out the changers' money. And He overturned the tables. And He said to those who sold doves, take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of what? A house of merchandise. What should it be? A place of worship. So this stuff was necessary. So where do you do it? Outside. Someplace not there. You made it a house of merchandise. Then His disciples remembered what? Remembered that it was written, zeal for your house has eaten me up. Now, where did that come from? Are you guys seeing in your cross references in your Bible? Where does that come from? Psalm 69. Comes from Psalm 69. Zeal for my house has eaten me up. So the people have a response to it. The Jews answered and said to Him, what? What did they want to know? A sign. What sign do you show to us since you do these things? What was their point? What were they wanting? What were they questioning? His right to do it. This was a big, big deal. What is the sign that you're willing to show us to indicate that you've got the authority to do these things? Remember, the Jews frequently wanted to know and wanted to probe at the authority that Jesus had. So what did He tell them in verse 19? Destroy this temple. In 3 days I'll raise it up. They respond to that in verse 20 by saying, it has taken how long? 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up again in 3 days. Notice in your notes that the temple was begun in 19 BC. 46 years would put us at about AD 27 or 28. Okay, so AD 27 or 28. So that puts Jesus dying on the cross and the establishment of the church closer, I believe, to 30 AD than what has been usually said, 33 AD. But the point is, whether you go back and forth about 3 years or not, the real irony was they had worked on this temple for 46 years. They weren't done with it. How long would it take them to finish it? In all, how long was the project? How long was the project? The loop is going to take 2 years. At least the section now that they're working on. 2 years. 58 won't be done until next year. How long did it take them to work on that temple? Altogether, it took 80 years. So here was the irony. They finished it in AD 64. The Romans besieged the city beginning in AD 66. They finally destroyed it in AD 70. So they had built this magnificent structure, and it only existed for a handful of years. The golden era when everything was done and finished was less than 10 years, and then it was torn up. So it's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it again in 3 days. But of course, in verse 21, what was he talking about? Temple of His body. And in His trial, when we get to His trial, this was taken and twisted. So what were they trying to make out of Jesus when they brought it up at His trial? We're a long way away from that, but what point were they trying to make? Right. He was a blasphemer. He was an insurrectionist. He wanted to what? He wanted to destroy the temple. Yeah, that's exactly right. But he was speaking of the temple of His body. Therefore, though, John adds, therefore, what takes place? When He had risen from the dead, His disciples remembered that He had said this to them, and they believed the Scripture and the word which Jesus had said. So let's comment on that just a little bit. First of all, where did it leave the disciples in their understanding compared to the opponents of Jesus? They were in the same boat. They understood, at this point in time, they understood about as much as the opponents of Jesus did. But they also could remember these events that were transpiring. Jesus rises from the dead again, and what did the disciples remember? Oh, he said that He was going to rise on the third day. Actually, there's a number of statements where Jesus actually spoke about His resurrection. In fact, there's 8 specific ones where the Lord talks about Him coming back from the dead. Now, this isn't just Him dying, but Him coming back from the dead. Because I can stand up here and make a prediction that I'm going to die. And eventually, what's going to happen? I'm going to be right. I don't know if it's going to be soon or if it's going to be far away. Could be either. But eventually I'm going to be right if I can predict my own death. So understand, with Jesus predicting His death, that was a big thing. But when He predicted His resurrection, now what was He saying? This was a really, really big deal. If you think about it this way, if we just use the general frame of reference of the world being 4,000 years old at this point, again, let's just go with that. The world being 4,000 years old at that point, how many people had ever come back from the dead? How many people had come back from the dead? You can fit them on one hand. This was not a what? This was not a frequent occurrence. This was not something that happened a lot. Jesus predicting His own death was, again, a monumental deal. But I just want to say, Him being able to predict His resurrection was really, really incredible. And He didn't just do it once. He did it 8 times. The PP here stands for the parallel passage. So it's not just that it's mentioned 8 times when you take 4 Gospels. These are 8 specific instances. So he's mentioning this. It's like when we see, and we'll get the opportunity to see the instruction of Jesus at multiple times in multiple places. And you would think, well, why would Jesus need to say that that only those who say unto me, that not only those who say unto me, Lord, Lord, will be saved, but those who do the will of my Father? Why do you need to repeat it twice? Because it was a different time, and it was a different place, it was a different audience. 8 separate times He says this. And again, it just makes and I think as evidenced by what John says, it makes the impressiveness really, really known. So let's look at the rest of the account here in verse 23. Now, when He was in Jerusalem at the Passover during the feast, many what? Believed in His name when they saw the signs which He did. So what were those signs? What were those signs? This is sort of a trick question. What were those signs? We don't what? We don't really know. This is one of these instances that I was talking to you about either last week or the week prior, where we've got all of these miracles of Jesus, but there were also, and maybe there's a strong case to be made, that while you've got 35 miracles that are actually articulated in the Gospels, more than likely there's what? Many, many more that are never actually specifically listed. I would simply suggest that John chapter 2 is one of these instances that's telling us about things that are being done that we don't really have a detail of an account about. But because He's doing them, what's occurring with people? They're believing in them. But in verse 24, Jesus did not commit Himself to them because He knew all men and had no need that anyone should testify of man, for He knew what was in man. So usually we use 24 and 25 as just solid evidence that Jesus knew what was in the hearts of people. But to what end in verses 24 and 25? What's it saying? What's it saying? What? He knew what was in their hearts. Now, this is in your notes because it's not immediately available to us in the English. In verse 23, many believed in His name. Verse 24, Jesus did not commit Himself. Believed and committed are the same word. So people believed in Him for what reason? His signs, His miracles, but He was not willing to what? Basically to believe in them. Why? Because at this moment, He knew what was in man, and what was He seeing? They were believing for what reason? Because they had seen these miracles. At this time, it was more of a superficial faith. Now, what would come if people were to spend more time with Jesus and become a follower of His? What would happen to that superficial faith? Well, it would grow. But right now, in this moment, Jesus knew what was in them, and He could see that their belief was not based off of anything except just seeing the miracles. So He wasn't willing to commit or to believe in them, likely as His true devoted followers, until more of that belief developed in their hearts. Okay? And I think when I think about that, I just kind of think about the fact that it's wonderful for us to see in Scripture and begin that process of believing, of committing to God. But what needs to happen to our faith? It needs to continually grow. That's exactly right. Kind of just like the message that you're seeing in John chapter 2, without it actually expressly saying it. Okay, next week we will get into John chapter 3. So at this point, we're starting 3 very important interviews. Jesus with Nicodemus, Jesus with the woman at the well, and then Jesus with the nobleman.